So hi, I'm Zoey Isherwood, and I'm going to be going over my poster titled Measuring the 1/n Spatiotemporal Amplitude Spectrum of the DynTex database. And so it is well established that natural scenes have a 1/n drop-off of spatial and temporal frequencies. Spatially, the exponent or slope of this drop-off, denoted as alpha, has often been reported as being equal to -1. However, more recent work in the spatial domain has actually revealed that only a few natural scenes conform to this value of -1. So instead, photographs of natural scenes on average have a slope around -1.2 and can range between -0.8 to -1.4. And so currently, in terms of the temporal domain, it's unknown whether this same wide distribution exists, as only very few movies have been analysed looking at the distribution of amplitude as a function of temporal frequencies. So far, I've found that only 20 movies have been analysed, and this was mainly due to the fact that in the late 90s and early 2000s, there were quite a lot of computational limitations which don't exist now. And so we attempted to fill this gap in the literature by analysing a massive movie database known as the DynTex database. And specifically, we looked at the golden set, which was a subset of 397 movies. And what we did was label these movies into natural, mixed, and unnatural categories. And then we looked at the amplitude spectrum in space and time across these three categories and compared them. And so in terms of how we actually measured the amplitude spectrum, so we use MATLAB code, which is freely available, looking at the spatial and temporal 1/n amplitude spectrum. And if you would like more details on these codes, you can look at this publication down here. And just to quickly go over it, so for each movie, in terms of how we measure the spatial amplitude spectrum, we extracted each frame of each movie, ran a 2D FFT, got an estimate of the slope in the spatial domain, and then for each frame we got this estimate, and then we averaged across all of the estimates and report the average slope across frames as well as the standard deviation. And in terms of what we did in the temporal domain, what we did was run a 3D FFT across the entire movie for each movie. And in the Fourier domain, we collapsed across X and Y dimensions and then plotted amplitude as a function of temporal frequency on a log-log axis, and then got an estimate of the slope denoted here as alpha. And so now I'm going to show you the distribution of values that we found firstly spatially. And so we've got violin plots here for each category, so natural, mixed, and unnatural. And as you can see, there's quite a wide distribution for the natural category as well as the other ones. So for natural, it centers around -1.1. And for mixed and unnatural, they're significantly steeper around -1.3. And so these findings are basically just replications, as this has been reported many times in the past. But in terms of the main findings of this present study, the temporal slope estimates. And so I'm going to show you the same plot, but for temporal slopes. And as you can see here, everything shifted upwards, everything's shallower, and this is quite a surprise, at least for the natural category, because we were predicting that values would center around -1, so similar to the spatial domain, but instead we get a median for the natural category of -0.5, and mixed and unnatural were significantly shallower around -0.4. And so this was quite a surprise given our original predictions, and so we tried to think, well, what's going on? And firstly, the simplest answer would be that perhaps, we're analyzing a much larger set of movies, and perhaps these values are actually more representative of what's going on in the environment. But another thing we wanted to think about was the frame rate or resolution in which these movies were recorded at. And so these movies were recorded at a relatively low frame rate for today's standards, which was at 25 frames per second. And so what we wanted to do was look at a simulation of how downsampling can actually affect your estimate of the slope. And so what we did was take a video, which I took of a natural scene outside at 60 frames per second, and this was a 6-second long video. We also had a 6-second long noise movie, but this was generated at 960 frames per second. So we wanted to look at the consequences of downsampling in the context of space and time. And that's everything that I just said. In terms of space, so we started out at 1024 by 1024 and downsampled to 32 by 32. And so you can see that the input and output, so red is natural movie, black is the noise image. So here it's inputs equal to output essentially. But then once you get to 64 by 64, you can see that there are dramatic differences in what you actually measure. So it looks like anything above 64 by 64 spatially is a good representation of what's out there in the environment. You're not getting any loss. And temporally, looking at 960 to 60, there's relatively little loss in the temporal domain, but as soon as you get to 30 and 20, there seems to be a massive difference in your input versus output slope. And so it looks like perhaps we need to look at a database at 60 frames per second rather than something lower than that. And so here's some examples of the movies captured at different frame rates or downsampled rather, and you can see that for lower frame rates, you get choppier video, and it's already choppy because it's going over Zoom. Sorry about that. But in terms of conclusions very quickly now, so we measure the amplitude spectra of the DynTex database, we replicate past work in the spatial domain. In the temporal domain, we find something very different, whereby the natural category, for the natural category, slopes center around negative 0.5. However, our findings may be unique to the DynTex database itself, and specifically, we're thinking it's most likely due to the frame rate in which the videos were sampled at. So in future, I'd like to analyze many more data sets, preferably above 25 frames per second. And if any of you know any more data sets that I don't have listed here, I'd love to hear about them and I'd like to analyze them. Thanks for listening.